Hello Internet, my name is Cowmill, I have a GM's Guide, and this is that GM's Guide, but instead of regular, it's on YouTube. Today we're going to be digging into serial campaigns, mega dungeons, mega cities, and mega mysteries, and to polish off all of that fairly rote stuff, we'll be capping it off with wilderness campaigns, which are not really related to Wilderness Journeys, but which have a similar name, because I already recorded the last episode and it's too late to change it now. So we're going to start with serial campaigns, the most obvious campaign structure. A serial campaign is a series of adventures strung together with no overarching structure at all. Our heroes go on an adventure, that adventure tells a self-contained story, and then next week they do something completely different. There can be recurring villains, and some locations may come up again and again. A single recurring villain might even turn out to have been behind most or all of the conflicts so far, and the result of one adventure might end up being the plot hook for the next one. A serial campaign doesn't mean there's no continuity. What it does mean is that there's no bigger game being played. The players follow whatever plot hook is put in front of them, and in some cases there might be more than one, but ultimately the adventure they go on is mainly selected based on what the GM is prepared to run right now. This is dead simple and flexible enough to work with almost any theme, but it pays a cost by being constantly nailed to a small scope. It's difficult for players to feel like they're accomplishing anything grand or earth-shattering in this structure. Saving the world in the last adventure doesn't feel much more compelling than if you saved the world in the first adventure, because none of the adventures you had before had any kind of direct impact on the game state of the last adventure. In a more structured campaign, winning or losing an adventure changes the state of the map, or the intrigue, or whatever. In a serial adventure, winning or losing the adventure will generate different plot hooks for the next one probably, but whether a recurring villain cackles about how he's beaten you before and will do so again, or swears that this time he will be the victor, is ultimately a pretty trivial difference. That's not to say the adventures are meaningless. Just because the Shire being overrun by orcs has no particular impact on the next adventure, where you help the dwarves, the Blue Mountains, and the elves of Lindon put their differences aside, well, that doesn't mean that's not a tragedy that the Shire was lost. What it means is just that there is a cost to the simplicity of a serial campaign, and that cost is that the grand scale of a D&D campaign, something which by its nature is an endeavor that requires a minimum of several months to complete, and that's no small time commitment, you don't put that grand scale to full use. Now, that's not to say that serial campaigns are a bad idea. We've brought up some campaign structures, or adventure structures, just to say that they're bad, like with Railroad Adventures in the Art of Adventures. But that's not what I'm saying about serial campaigns. There are many good reasons to run a serial campaign. If you only play once a month or less, it's usually best to keep individual adventures as self-contained as possible. If you're new to GMing, serial campaigns are easier to run than others, and it's usually wise to start with a serial campaign and then add in a greater structure later on, if you feel like it. If you barely have enough time to write adventures, stretching yourself thin by fleshing out a campaign structure to slot them into might be really harmful to the quality of your individual adventures. Serial campaigns can be perfectly enjoyable so long as the adventures in them are good, so don't be afraid to run one. That said, no further advice is really needed to run a serial campaign, just make good adventures. We've made videos about that already. Now, mega dungeons, mega cities, and mega mysteries are three campaign structures that are too straightforward to require complete videos, so I'm just packaging them together here at the beginning. A mega dungeon is just a single dungeon made so unspeakably vast as to be able to sustain an entire campaign by itself, and a mega city is the same thing applied to urban crawls, which we'll get into when we talk about hex crawls a little bit later on. In both cases, the only advice particularly needed is already included in the Art of Adventures. In the case of the mega dungeon, just make sure you maintain enough variety in both opposition and layout that it doesn't get dull. In the case of a mega city, you're using an urban crawl to string together lots of encounters and adventures just like with a hex crawl, but unlike with a hex crawl, there's no particular process for moving from one location to another. Make sure you have enough content to last for 12 or 13 sessions at least. Create a city with enough neighborhoods to contain that content without getting more than 3 or 4 adventures deep in one neighborhood, and then you're done. Again, we'll talk more about urban crawls when we get to the hex crawls video, but the point here is that a megacity is just a really big urban crawl. Now, creating that much content is obviously not a small task, but it's all encounter and adventure design. The campaign structure is only slightly more complex than a serial campaign. A mega mystery requires a little bit more elaboration. A mystery campaign is built on the same 3 clues principles as a mystery adventure, but rather than having the clues contained in a single adventure, some scenes have the clues to them spread throughout multiple adventures. The final scene of an introductory adventure contains 3 clues, and each one pointing to the introductory scene of a completely different mystery adventure. So these adventures then contain more clues to other adventures, sometimes in their final scene, sometimes in midway scenes. scene might contain 3 clues to do with the current mystery, as per the usual 3 clues method, but then a 4th clue that leads to a completely different mystery. Seed clues for that completely different mystery in 3 different mysteries, and, as per the 3 clues method, you can be pretty sure that by the time they get to the end of all 3 of those mysteries, the players will have unlocked the secrets of that 4th mystery. Now, so long as each mystery contains at least 3 clues pointing to other mysteries, and each mystery has at least 3 clues pointing to it from other mysteries, you can safely assume that sooner or later players will find all of them. Just keep those numbers balanced. Just like with the standard 3 clues method from the adventure, if the players miss all 3 clues, then new clues can be produced by having the villains advance their agenda in some way that leaves a new mystery behind. You know, they murder another victim or something. And then that mystery contains clues to the start of whatever mystery the players have missed. If this happens often enough, the villains might advance their agenda to the point where they succeed in whatever dark ritual they have cooking up, thus prompting a boss fight with Cthulhu at an earlier level than was planned, which would probably end poorly for the players. Players need to be prepared to take lots of notes for a full-on mystery campaign, both because this will help them catch clues and more importantly because it will help them keep track of the leads they've already found. A single mystery contains clues pointing to as many as 3 other mysteries, and if players manage to find all 3, they could quite possibly forget one of them by the time they've solved the other 2. Especially if they discover even more mysteries while investigating those 2, and follow up on those before getting back to the one left over from the first set. The main question for a mystery campaign is how to structure the ending. You can always just have the climax mystery be sitting on top of a large tower of mysteries. The intro mystery has clues leading to mysteries A1, B1, and C1. A1 has clues leading to B1, C1, and A2. A2 has clues leading to A3, B2, and C2, and so on. Just like with an expanded mystery adventure. This is a perfectly reasonable way to build a mystery campaign if you don't mind risking that a lot of your work will be missed and that at least some of it is virtually guaranteed to be mixed. It's unlikely but entirely possible that players will go from the intro and go straight up the A pillar, from A1 to A2 to A3 to the climax adventure, completely skipping over all 6 adventures in the B and C pillars, over half the work you've done for the campaign. It's quite likely that players will get through at least one level of the tower without completing all 3 mysteries on that level. They'll do A2, get a clue to C2, they'll go from C2 to C3, and they'll never finish B2. One way to solve this is by making the goal to solve every mystery, not just the topmost one. For example, rather than the goal simply being to find the head of the cult and stab him before he can summon Cthulhu, perhaps Cthulhu's dreams influencing cultists and monsters and spawning cyclopean horrors about his own awakening, which means that there is no head of the snake to cut off. I mean, technically there is, but it's Cthulhu. If you're encountering Cthulhu, then you've kind of already messed up. So the players need to put a stop to each cult and star spawn and so on trying to awaken Cthulhu in various different ways. The issue with this method is that there's no final confrontation. If that's not something you and your group need for a satisfying conclusion, then this method works perfectly well. But if you want a final confrontation, then another way of solving the problem is by having the mysteries be interconnected web, but the opposition is more linear. For example, the one mystery is about discovering the location of Rillier and stopping the cultists from going there to wind up Cthulhu's alarm clock. Another is about preventing them from performing a mass ritual sacrifice when the stars align. And the third is about stopping them from recovering the Necronomicon and reading from it the magic spell that will awaken Cthulhu. I'm aware that I'm mangling the mythos lore here, but translating Lovecraft faithfully into D&D is not the point of this example. So the actual specific cult lieutenant attempting to complete these rituals happens in the same order no matter what order the players discover and investigate the mysteries. The first one the players investigate is always a goblin cult, the second one is always a vampire and his spawn, and the third one is always a mind flayer and his thralls. This has the disadvantage that you can't make any of your clues have to do with the antagonist of a mystery because the antagonist is undefined until the players begin to investigate. You can't have the players learn about the cult's trip to Rillier by reading correspondence where they talk about how the Mind Flayer is out to Rillier because maybe the Mind Flayer is actually the one chasing the Necronomicon. The advantage to this method, however, is that the final confrontation will always be with the primary villain. You could also have the final confrontation trigger after all mysteries are solved and be some other sort of adventure entirely. Maybe each cult lieutenant holds one fragment of a key to Rillier, and the last adventure is a dungeon crawl through the primordial city. This method can be done in stages, so that one web of mysteries, after being entirely cleared, leads to, let's say, a wilderness journey. And that in turn leads to a new intro mystery that leads the party into a new mystery web, thus providing the occasional non-mystery adventure for variety. Finally, you can always just ask your players to play along. Yes, you found the lead on the head of the cult, but you also have 3 other leads you haven't followed up on, and you're going to need to chase them all down eventually, so how about we leave the final boss for the end? This has the disadvantage that it's a really out-of-game reason to put off the head of the cult, but If the other methods all require drastic overhauls to your campaign that you think will do more harm than good, there's nothing particularly wrong with using this option. So, that's the relatively straightforward ones. Now let's really get into the meat of this and talk about a wilderness campaign. A wilderness campaign is about steadily decreasing the danger of regions by completing quests in them. As the total number of available quests in a region goes down, the region becomes safer to travel through. This not only helps the party get around with less hassle, it also helps anyone trying to maintain law and order out because they send patrols out without getting them eaten by trolls. We will assume that the local authorities are not evil tyrants. A wilderness campaign is primarily intended for clearing out a wilderness full of manticores and hydras and so forth, and establishing a prosperous kingdom instead. But it can also be used for wars, or a warring states period, where instead of making the land safer to travel through because there are fewer monsters in the wilderness, they instead become safer because there are fewer enemy armies trying to stab your peasants for wearing the wrong color of hat. Wilderness campaigns are about constantly pushing back against forces that want to swallow up what your party holds dear. The wilderness contains quests that spawn other quests, making their home regions more and more dangerous until eventually they fill up and the danger spills over into neighboring regions, and then the regions that neighbor the neighboring regions, and then the regions neighboring those regions until eventually the entire map, including the party's hometown, is overrun. The party, for reasons base or noble, will push back against this overflow and eventually reach the sources and close them off one by one. Wilderness campaigns are great not only for holding the forces of a chaotic wilderness at bay, as well as an extraplanar invasion, and they work reasonably well for plain old war stories. So here's how it works. The playable area is split up into a number of regions. Each region takes a static amount of time to move through on foot, so for example, maybe every region takes 1 week to get through, or every region takes 1 day. Whatever it is, it's the same for everywhere, which means that some regions, like mountains or swamps, might be much smaller but have more difficult terrain, while others might be enormous because of how clear and open they are, like plains. The amount of time it takes to get from one place to another on foot is called the strategic turn. Being mounted cuts movement time in half, allowing the party to move through 2 regions in 1 strategic turn, and this stacks with the buff for roads that we'll discuss in a little bit. If you're mounted on something particularly fast, especially something flying, you might be able to move 3 regions in a single strategic turn. Now each region can hold between 0 and 4 quests, and it becomes more and more dangerous as it gets more quests in it. Now, there are 3 different means of traveling to a region from one another depending on how involved you want the travel to be, but each one reflects how dangerous the region is based on how many quests are left inside of it. So first of all, there is the Journey DC method. In this method, each character making the journey rolls a Constitution saving throw against the Journey DC appropriate to whatever region they are traveling to. So DC 10 for traveling into a restless region, regardless of how dangerous the region they're exiting is. If they succeed, they take no damage. If they fail, they lose 1 hit die, plus 1 more hit die for every 5 points they miss the DC by. If they run out of hit dice, roll the remaining hit dice as damage. For example, if a character has 2d6 hit dice and misses a Journey DC by 10 points, they lose their 2d6 hit dice and then take 1d6 damage. This method is very quick and means that travel is over in a matter of minutes, which means that it's possible to make long journeys across multiple regions without dedicating an entire session to it. It works well for campaigns where the party is expected to be running around the map, putting out fires all across the realm. Using this method, long distances are only concerning if they're also dangerous, and players will think nothing of traveling back and forth through many peaceful regions unless they're on a time limit. In random encounter travel, the party has exactly 1 random encounter whenever they journey into a region. Whatever region they are journeying into, they roll on the appropriate random encounter table, and it's perfectly fine to use the same table for similar areas, and then they add a random encounter modifier for the region's level of threat. So for example, at Restless it's -2, at Border it's -4, and so on. The random encounter tables are a d6 and normally contain beneficial or at least indifferent encounters. Maybe you find a merchant whose wagon is broken in an axle, or you find a friendly cleric who offers you a buff of some kind. Encounters of 0 and below, only possible when rolling at a penalty, are instead your more typical random encounters. Goblin ambushes, orc raids, beguilers posing as travelers in distress who try to make you into mind slaves, that kind of thing. The encounters get nastier the further down the chart they go, until at -7 you get fire giants looking to enslave the little people, and things like that. This example assumes a low to mid-level campaign. At higher levels, fire giants might be your standard encounter mooks, and encounter -7 is an ancient red dragon or something similarly epic. It's perfectly acceptable to have some regions have low-level encounter tables and have others have high-level encounter tables. Even when completely overrun and hostile, the Shire doesn't serve up anything nastier than trolls, while the elemental plane of fire can be preyed upon by Efreeti or fire giants even when only restless. Because the encounter die is a d6, the friendly encounters that are ubiquitous in a peaceful region are entirely absent from a dangerous or a hostile region. At that point, you are past the border. This method means that traveling into or through dangerous areas is perilous, but only in the most dire of circumstances is it at all likely to be immediately lethal. Traveling through one region will likely only take 20 or 30 minutes, but traveling through several can easily take up an entire session, so this method will make characters more reluctant to travel long distances and helps build a feeling that places that are far away, but it still means that visiting a neighboring region is fairly inconsequential, so long as it's a neighboring region. Finally, there's the Wilderness Journey travel. In this variant, every journey from one region to another requires a complete Wilderness Journey adventure, as described in earlier videos. The journey uses the appropriately sized journey die depending on the area's threat level. For example, a restless region uses a d6, and a border region uses a d8. One end of the journey is stapled onto the top of the encounter table, and the other is stapled onto the bottom. For example, let's say the party wants to journey from Phlan to Zhentil Keep along the Iron Route. If the Iron Route region is currently restless, the appropriate die is a d6, so the GM makes an encounter table using the first 6 encounters of the Iron Route region. That means that Phlan is encounter 0, and Zhentil Keep is encounter 7. If the Iron Route becomes a border region, Zhentil Keep will be moved to position 9. 2 more encounters will be added to the table for slots 7 and 8, and the journey now uses a d8 instead of a d6. Phlan is still at encounter 0. The advantage of this method is that it adds a lot of depth to the areas between major destinations. Since those first 4 encounters remain no matter how deadly the region gets, there will always be a few encounters that mainly serve to provide local flavor. The disadvantage is that places that are completely overrun with monsters or the forces of tyranny will still have those first 4 peaceful encounters who continue going about their business more or less like nothing's happened. If you're willing to put in a bit of extra work, you can have these encounters change based on the current threat level. For example, a farmstead at the side of the road might hail the adventurers and invite them in for dinner when it's peaceful, be shuttered and suspicious when it's border, and be a burned out wreck being picked over by a few stray goblins at hostile. This method also means that even short journeys through minimally threatening areas take a long time, and can easily be an entire session unto themselves, which is either good or bad depending on how much you want a feeling of distance in your campaign. Using this method, even neighboring regions seem distant, which can help build a sense of isolation, that each region is on their own and can only count on help from friendly neighbors in exceptional circumstances. Regardless of which method you use, it is strongly recommended to use the Gritty Realism Rest variant in the Dungeon Master's Guide, page 267. Requiring a full 7 days of rest for a long rest means that the damage characters take from a random encounter or from failing a DC will actually matter, and without that long rest variant, the journeys become a hassle rather than a threat. With normal healing, random encounters are only threatening if they can kill you in one go. Wilderness journeys are exhausting but inconsequential since almost none of the encounters in them are individually lethal, and journey DCs are completely pointless as soon as level 3 because it's almost impossible for a journey DC to kill you, and the 8-hour long rest you get for free each night of your 7-day journey will immediately erase all damage. With 7-day long rests, shrugging off the effects of a journey requires time, which is often at a premium in a wilderness campaign. If you use the recommended week-long strategic turn, then taking a long rest means spending one strategic turn to heal up, which is nice and neat and makes taking that long rest a difficult decision. Okay, so how many regions do you want in your wilderness campaign? If you want to see a campaign through to completion, you need to take a handle on how long it's going to take, and in a wilderness campaign, that's a function of how many regions there are. A region has 2.5 quests on average, and a quest takes 1.5 sessions to complete on average. So if we round up a little to get a nice whole number, each region is going to take about 4 sessions. 4 regions is a pretty good number for the average campaign, since making it to 16 sessions is usually pretty doable. Some campaigns often actually fall apart in the first 3 sessions, and you can't really fit any kind of campaign into that space. But if your campaign makes it past the first 3 sessions, then lasting for a couple of months for that 16 session campaign length is usually pretty easy. It's short, but it's enough for a complete campaign. Of course, that's a rough estimate, and the more fancy quest types you use, the more that estimate will vary, usually in the direction of making things longer. And that means 2 things. First, don't use a wilderness campaign at all if you have a very strict number of sessions you need to keep to. And second, you probably want to avoid using too many special quests from the next section unless your group is stable enough that you can count on it lasting for a campaign that's twice as long as you thought it would be. Now, some quests spawn other quests. We'll get into the details of that when we discuss some of the quest types in a little bit, but what's important for now is that most of these quest spawners don't stop just because their current region is full. When a new quest is about to be added to a region, check to see how many quests its neighbors already have. If there is a neighbor nearby who has 2 fewer quests than the region the new quest is about to be added to, that new quest instead spills over into the neighboring region. For example, let's assume that Thar and the Iron Root are neighboring regions. The Iron Root is restless with 1 quest, and Thar is dangerous, which means it has 3. A new quest is about to be added to Thar, but because the Iron Root has 2 fewer quests already, the new quest instead spills over into the Iron Root. The Iron Root is now a border region with 2 quests, which means the next time a quest is added to Thar, it will stay there, giving Thar 4 quests, which makes it a hostile region. If a region fills up with a maximum of 4 quests, any new quests added will automatically spill over to nearby regions, starting with whichever region has the fewest quests currently. If all neighboring regions are full, it will spill over to the neighbor's neighbors, again starting with the least dangerous region. Eventually, the campaign realm will be filled up completely. If a region remains peaceful for long enough, however, it will begin to prosper. Each region has a prosperity die. This is a D6 by default, but regions that are particularly rich with resources will be a D4, and regions that are particularly barren will be a D8. Every strategic turn, every region that is peaceful rolls their prosperity die. If they roll a max value, they begin to prosper. An already prospering region rolls max on its prosperity die, it begins to flourish. If an already flourishing region rolls max on its prosperity die, it will begin booming. A region that is booming which becomes restless drops to flourishing. A region that is flourishing or booming and becomes border drops to prospering, and a region that becomes dangerous or hostile ceases prospering altogether. Now, regardless of how prosperous a region is, it still cannot roll to become more prosperous until it is peaceful. Regions that are both prosperous and restless do not get to roll to become flourishing, even though flourishing regions remain as such when they become restless. The effects of flourishing and booming depend on what kind of region it is, but all prospering regions build roads. Traveling through a region with a road requires only half the time it would normally, and that stacks with the buff for mounts discussed further up, so a party with mounts traveling entirely through regions with roads can cross 4 regions in 1 strategic turn. However, it does not stack with the benefit from flying mounts. Flying mounts don't use the roads in the first place. As such, it can actually be faster to take land-based mounts through roads than flying mounts. Of course, the advantage to flying mounts is that they allow you to cross lots of territory when you don't have roads, which is where most of the action is. This means that the flying mount is the symbol of the wilderness adventurer, the vanguard who rides out ahead of civilization or the safety of friendly territory, whereas a regular old horse is actually more efficient for your standard knight or patrolman who just guards territory that is already fairly safe. Now, keeping track of fractional movement between adventurers is ugly and players don't like doing it, so don't. A party with mounts has 2 points of movement. Regions with roads cost half a point to cross, whereas regular regions cost 2 points. If the party enters a region with roads for half a point total, then they enter a region with a full point for a point and a half total, and then they want to enter another region, also without roads, for 2.5 total points of movement, then they just can't. They don't get halfway, they just can't until next turn. Now, let's briefly go over a couple of the region bonuses that you get for flourishing or booming regions, depending on what kind of special features they have. You can find a full list in the written version of this guide. I won't read through all of them here, but I will read through a couple of them to give you an idea of how they work. For example, farmland. Every region has some farmable area, but a farmland region is covered in it. It's abundant. When prosperous, food, lodging, and mounts cost 10% less. When flourishing, they cost 20% less, and when booming, 30% less. More importantly, the region can support a large population and thus has large levies. Each strategic turn this region is prospering, whether the party is present or not, this region rolls a d6. On a 6, a quest of the party's choice is cleared. When the region is flourishing, the range is expanded to 5 to 6, and when it is booming, it may clear quests in neighboring regions as well. Fortified quests can't be cleared by levies, and at the GM's discretion, certain other very dangerous quests, stereotypically the local dragon, may be immune to being cleared by the levies as well. But a farmland region that begins to prosper, or especially to flourish or boom, gives a chance that it will be able to hold off invading enemies all by itself without the party having to intervene, even from its neighbors, which is particularly useful. Now, let's look at the library. A library contains a vast repository of knowledge. Most regions will have a library in them somewhere, but this one is a real Library of Alexandria kind of deal. Any knowledge checks made here gain advantage even if the region is not prospering, although if it is dangerous or hostile, the library may have unfriendly guests. When prospering, the library has a large repository of spells. When a character wants the scroll of any spell, they may roll a d20 with a penalty equal to 3 times the spell's level. So a first level spell would be a d20 minus 3, a second level spell would be a d20 minus 6, and so on. If the result is at least 10, the library has a scroll of that spell. Now in flourishing, the roll is made at advantage, and when booming, the penalty is reduced to 2 times the spell's level. If the library has 1 copy of the spell, the party may roll again immediately to see if they have another. If the library does not have a copy of the spell this turn, the party may return on a different turn and roll again to see if they've acquired one. Each scroll costs 200 gold pieces times the spell's level, although copying the scroll into your spellbook is usually done at cost. The library may charge you if they particularly dislike you, or even if they're just indifferent to you, but most of the time a library in a flourishing region, or even a prospering one, is prospering because of all the heroism you're doing, and they're generally speaking willing to let you look at their scrolls and copy them free of charge, although actually buying them to use as a consumable scroll does always cost money. Now you can also have a wizard's tower. A wizard in the tower will give out gifts to heroes who make his backyard less troublesome. When the region is prosperous, you can roll on the table for a challenge 0 to 4 treasure hoard on the first week of each month if the heroes are present, or as soon as they arrive in the region if they are not, and the wizard gifts the hero with whatever magic items they are rolled, which on a roll of 28 or below is none. Wizards are fickle. Ignore all the coins, gems, and art objects. Now when the region is flourishing, the wizard makes his gifts on the first and third week of the month, and when the region is booming, the wizard gives out the magic items of a challenge 0 to 4 treasure hoard on the first week of the month, and the magic items of a challenge 5 to 10 treasure hoard on the third week of the month. If the players do not visit the region for an extended period of time, they receive only the gifts of the last month when they arrive, and you can adjust weeks and months to suit the length of your strategic turn if it is not weekly. You can also have the wizard send the gifts along to the heroes if they are in a region connected to the wizard's tower by roads. Now let's talk about quests. Quests are the beating heart of a wilderness campaign. Each quest is an adventure of some kind. See the Art of Adventures for advice on how to make those. One might be a mystery to track down a killer monster lurking in the wilderness. Another might be a dungeon crawl to root out goblin raiders hiding out in an abandoned dwarven mine. A third might be a wilderness journey through dangerous lands to reach the lair of a young green dragon menacing the woods. In addition to being written up as a regular adventure, such as you might find in any campaign structure, each quest also has a type relevant to its use on the campaign map. We aren't going to go through all of the quest types because, again, that would just take too long, and this video has gone on quite long enough already. But you can see the full list in the written version of this guide. Now, first off, there's static quests, which are the most basic kind of quest. A static quest does not move around or affect other quests nearby. It boosts the threat level of the region by 1, and that is it. The more of your quests are static quests, the more predictable the map will be. On the one hand, this means that the campaign will have less time pressure and fewer surprises, but on the other hand, it means you're less likely to accidentally set up a spawner train that drowns the players in a sea of orcs before they can even get their Boots of Elvenkind on. Spawner quests are the most common kind of quest in a wilderness campaign, except for static quests, and every wilderness campaign needs some of them to work. A spawner quest comes with a die size, and at the end of every strategic turn, every spawner quest that hasn't been cleared rolls its associated die. On a 1, it spawns a new quest. These quests represent villains who are actively trying to conquer the campaign area, whether that's a necromancer lord raising up undead armies or a hobgoblin captain marching on the kingdom of Generica. A spawner quest will produce 1 new quest on a number of turns equal to half its value plus 0.5. So in other words, a D6 spawner produces a new quest every 3.5 turns, a D8 every 4.5 turns, and so on. This means that even a tiny D4 spawner can be quite sluggish compared to PCs actively trying to clear the region out, especially if they're willing to forego a long rest between quests. But small spawners can still fill up regions alarmingly quickly if players aren't paying attention. A D4 spawner produces a new quest every 2 or 3 turns, which means if it's on the other side of a largish map, say a dozen regions for a roughly year-long campaign in real time, if they're that far away from the party's starting region, it'll manage to pop out 1 quest before the party reaches the region at all, even if they make an immediate beeline for it. It means that clearing out the average region containing 2.5 quests will allow the spawner to pop out 1 new quest. As such, a small spawner is a constant pressure on the party when they're trying to solve other problems, but is unlikely to constantly regenerate quests that the party thought they had solved once they focused their attention on dealing with the problem. Larger spawners, a D6 or even a D8, put less pressure but still represent a threat that can't be ignored forever. Particularly on big maps, D6 or D8 spawners make for good problems that grow slowly but steadily. They're best used when paired with either threats that are supposed to be secondary to your faster spawners, or else threats that are more dangerous as individual quests. For example, fire and frost giants are a pretty big threat to low-level campaigns, so having a fire giant general as a D8 spawner turns him into a threat that produces few quests, but each quest is extremely dangerous. He doesn't cover much ground, but once he's taken a position, he will be very hard to dislodge. Creating spawned quests can be tricky. You have no idea how many quests will ultimately be spawned. You don't want your players to go through near-identical goblin caves 3 times while fighting the goblin warlord, but you also don't want to design a quest about recapturing a town from goblin invaders that never gets used because the players decided to head for that spawner first and it never got rolling before they took it out. Spawners tend to be high-priority targets for the party, so it's always possible that one will be removed before spawning anything. The easiest solution for this is to create a Schrodinger's adventure. Now, I don't generally approve of using Schrodinger's adventures to stealth railroad players by picking up whatever adventure you wanted them to complete next and dropping it in front of wherever they decided to go. However, a similar concept can be helpful to spawned quest design. If the party makes a beeline for the Goblin King spawner and clears it before it can even spawn the Goblin Dungeon, you can use that same dungeon layout for the Skeleton Dungeon that the Necromancer spawner popped out while they were dealing with the goblins. Another approach is to define 4 quests for each region, each quest representing some strategic location or person of interest, from the first quest being a remote outpost of the Forces of Evil raid, to the 4th quest being the conquest of the region's market town, and in between you can have them occupy mithril mines or drive loggers and hunters from the forests. Now, it doesn't matter which spawner specifically ends up capturing the mines and overrunning the market town. Whichever one happens to fill up the region first is the one whose mooks are lying around when the party gets around to dealing with them, but the layout, plot hook, and friendly NPCs are the same. If the spawners all answer to the same Dark Lord, you can even have some mini-bosses be the same regardless of what spawner ends up populating the region with quests. The Dark Lord can send an Erinyes to lead a dungeon regardless of whether the Dark Fae or the Ice Cult end up being the ones who provide the fodder troops for that dungeon. Although this does have the drawback that some regions will simply never have all 4 of their quest slots filled up at all. In fact, that's very common for regions near the start where players start clearing things very early on. Having the players skip over some of your content is just an occupational hazard of being a GM at all. But there's no such thing as wasted work, unless it's a lengthy treatise on the centuries-long conflict between the Gardenar and the Hobgoblins. That work was probably wasted. But for the GMing work, any work you do now will most likely be able to be repurposed later, even if it takes a while to come up again. The last quest type we'll discuss is bunker quests. You'll want some way to prevent players from just making a tour of the realm, popping off spawners before mopping up their spawn quests, and that is why most spawn quests should be bunker quests. A bunker quest fortifies another quest, usually the quest that spawned them, adding more or harder monsters or otherwise increasing the difficulty of that spawner quest so long as the bunker quest is still intact. This encourages players to clear out the spawn quests before taking on the villain masterminding the invasion in the spawner, while still leaving the option to go for the throat, especially if the spawner is threatening to overrun a region the players don't want to lose. As mentioned earlier, you can find more quest types in the written version of this guide. But let's close out this entirely too long episode by discussing discovering quests. In order to discover nearby quests, the party can roll an investigation check at DC 10. If they succeed, they learn of whichever quest in the region is the most obvious, at the GM's discretion. If they fail, they can't try again in the same region until the next strategic turn. For every 5 points by which the party succeeds in the check, they learn of 1 more quest in the region, or, if there are no more quests in the region, of 1 quest in a neighboring region. No amount of success on investigation checks will yield results from regions that do not neighbor the region the check was made in. News just doesn't travel that far. Exceptions may exist in certain cases for threats that are both very powerful, enough to be heard of even from very far away, and very old, such that there's been enough time for news of them to reach land weeks of travel away. Now, every rule in a role-playing game is subject to the fiction, but in this case, it's particularly worth noting that the party will often hear about quests without having rolled investigation for, just as a natural result of interacting with the world. If they have a personal audience with the king, that king is very likely to have a good grasp on what menaces are plaguing his land and will happily divulge that information to anyone interested in helping. Defeating one threat might lead directly to the discovery of other related threats while going through correspondence or interrogating prisoners. All this is not only fine, it's usually preferable to the fairly mechanical process of just rolling investigation and being told what's going on nearby. The ability to find new quests just by rolling for them is a fail-safe in case the party ever runs out of leads and needs to figure out what to do next. It's not a prerequisite for having adventures. So, that is Serial Campaigns, Mega Dungeons, Mega Cities, Mega Mysteries, and Wilderness Campaigns, something which really should have been split into 2 videos, but I'm at the end of the recording now, so whatever. Next time, we'll be talking about Intrigue Campaigns. I'll see you there.